One of the most interesting shows of the early 2000s is Word Girl. It ran for 7 seasons and featured dozens of unique characters. One of the most obscure characters, though, is Professor Stephen Boxleitner. I say obscure because he only appears in the shorts, which can't be viewed anywhere else other than fan uploads on YouTube. There used to be some on the official PBS Kids page, but they were taken down a couple years ago. His total screen time is around 3 minutes collectively out of all of the short season, which doesn't seem like a lot of time, and it really isn't. But the Word Girl writing is so rich that there is enough information to speculate. So the reason I'm talking about him in this video is because he's my favorite character. He's one of my favorite characters of all time. And I haven't really put all my thoughts together to explain why he's my favorite character. I think it seems a little odd to have a favorite character that, compared to every single other character on the show, this character's only on the show for about 3 minutes and it's not even in the official run. So I'm just putting all my thoughts and speculation and everything that I've seen in the shorts and in what I've seen in like the official show, because he's technically still there, but not really, into an organized list for everyone to see. So something that sort of went over my head until recently is the deep lore behind the character Dr. Two Brains, and in this video we're focusing more on the man before the accident, Professor Stephen Boxleitner. And when I say deep lore, I mean there's a lot to notice and speculate, knowing full well these details were probably not something that the Word Girl crew thought people 15 years later would still think about. I love Stephen so much, and honestly, even knowing the details aren't that deep, because the world of Word Girl was very lovingly crafted, they're fascinating details to find anyway. So Stephen hasn't really been a fan favorite until the last few years, with theories and speculation, and the drive from fans to unearth anything about him we can. This archaeology-like obsession with Word Girl really drives fans to gather anything, because we're starting off with so little, especially with PBS purging anything Word Girl related recently. It's this interesting phenomenon you see in fandoms like Gravity Falls and Over the Garden Wall, where the less information we have on something, the more we want to know about it, and we'll research and speculate as much as possible to connect the dots. In the first Stephen-centric short, What's Up, Doc?, we're formally introduced to the brilliant and kind-hearted Professor Stephen Boxleitner. We get to see Stephen in his lab for about 3 minutes of collective screen time before we never see him again. Though we hear him speak through Two Brains in one of the following shorts, expressing his concern and guilt about stealing cheese, but after that it's just Two Brains and Squeaky for the remainder of the series. At least that's what we see on the surface. From the very little time we had with Stephen, I am foolishly confident in my understanding of his character by analyzing the things he says and does in those few minutes. I'm going to call these Stephen mannerisms Stephenisms because it's kind of cute. So we see these Stephenisms in Two Brains' character because of what we learn about Squeaky in those first few shorts as well. I feel like this is also a math concept or maybe a riddle solving technique, but I don't remember. Also a quick note, PBS took down my last video for a few days because I showed clips from Word Girl to show context of what I was saying. So from now on I'm not going to use anything official from PBS and I'll just recreate everything myself. It's a lot more work, but I feel like it's worth it to not have to deal with them messing up my videos anymore. And this is the reason I won't be showing clips or screenshots in case anyone was about to leave a comment asking about it. So as a quick recap, Professor Stephen Boxleitner was a professor, a scientist, and an author. He was also a mentor to Word Girl and her friend. He was also very obsessed with food, and accidentally left his lab mouse Squeaky alone while he left to go grab his sandwich. Squeaky hit the "holy cow, don't press this button," and they fuse, and he becomes Dr. Two Brains, and he goes on a rampage and doesn't let anyone call him anything other than Dr. Two Brains, and becomes the city's most feared criminal. So whenever this book I'm about to bring up is shown or talked about, I feel like I just successfully spotted Tony Hawk at the grocery store, like in the way that I feel like I'm the only one that cares and no one else can recognize what an incredible and rare sight it is. It's also one of those props I want in my house, like the portal gun or Minecraft sword. It's times like these I miss Think Geek. I also like bookbinding, so I definitely plan to make this a real tangible book just to have one of these days. So in the first short, we see Stephen referencing a handbook, Superheroes and You, A Practical Guide. He uses it to find any helpful advice for Word Girl's problem of getting overwhelmed by the butcher at crime scenes. But to no avail, there's nothing helpful. He does come across the closest match to her problem, which is a barbecue ribs recipe by a Mazo guy, and he thinks out loud about it, but is cut off by Word Girl as they have a much more pressing issue to solve. And I've speculated in the past that this Amazo guy that's referenced in the book was maybe an old friend or a professional collaborator of sorts, or maybe just an icon of the city that Stephen wanted to feature. I want to lean more towards the two being old friends because of the silly nature of the recipe being included for such a serious book topic, as well as Stephen's overwhelming nature to want others around to talk to and discuss his experiments with. Although Amazo guy is likely a throwaway character, it's fun to imagine the possible mishaps and adventures the two encountered while writing the book together. Stephen being the author and a professor on the subject, and Amazo guy being a very notable reference and the face of the book for advertising purposes, maybe? I like to imagine that maybe Amazo guy is taking the bad guys down while Stephen's watching in the background, still dangerously close to the action, and is frantically scribbling down everything he's seeing and asking Amazo very badly timed questions like, "Are you scared right now? How do you plan to win this fight? Are you mentally preparing yourself to fight a villain twice your size? Oh, you just knocked down a power line. Does the city fine you every time you destroy a piece of public property?" And other silly questions for the book. Honestly, I could watch an entire multi-season show about how I imagine these two would interact. Because of Stephen's title as a professor and probably successful nonfiction author, this probably gave WordGirl the idea or motivation to become a superhero. Or she might have come across the book in her own research and decided to pay him a visit to further discuss the book. I like to imagine that Becky was absolutely blown away with the contents of the book that she had to meet the author and talk to him. And maybe Huggy got them some silly temporary uniforms to wear that definitely threw off Stephen's vibe until he could finish making their official ones. Maybe Stephen even helped her talk through her thoughts, fears, ambitions, and other overwhelming feelings she might have had before deciding to become a superhero, and without letting the people that she loves the most in this world know for their own safety. WordGirl also owns her own copy that sits on her bookshelf in her library/study in her spaceship in the episode Showdown at the Secret Spaceship Hideout, another in a gizmo box that we see in the episode Dr. Two Brains Mr. Cheese when WordGirl is trying to find her tracking device, and another in her home where we see her reading it in the PBS Kids storybook adventure game Becky's Day Off. In the storybook game, it's mentioned that this is one of her favorite books, on around the same level as the Princess Triana books, and in the episode Showdown at the Secret Spaceship Hideout, she mentions how she learned nearly everything about being a superhero from the book he wrote. Normally I wouldn't cite something that's very obviously just made to be online engagement, like the PBS Kids online games, but it supports my point, so it stays in the video. Stephen is probably the most educated and most capable character on the show, minus having superpowers, of course. We get to see a few of his qualifications in one of the shorts, and he mentions another degree, that one being cheese-related and probably a joke that he has in a later episode. I'll talk about Two Brains specifically in a Two Brains character analysis video later on. From what I've read about the writing style of the WordGirl crew, there are a lot of jokes that aren't meant to be taken seriously, like the cheese degree, but I don't think anyone clicked on this video to listen to a purely factual analysis without speculation and theories. Professor Stephen Boxleitner's qualifications, according to his office door, include a PhD and an MFA, as well as something listed as MOMA or MOMA, which after Googling for like 30 minutes, the only thing I could come up with is maybe another art degree or something. I'm not sure. This might be a joke that's going over my head, to be honest. And the following and final qualification listed on his office door is LMNOP, which I think is so funny and really cute. Also, given his title as a professor, we can assume he's an instructor at a college or university in Fair City. We really only get a glimpse of Stephen's office and laboratory in the shorts, but we find out his work is located in a government building since the police station is mentioned to be on the first floor and he's on the fourth floor. From this information we can speculate that this was his off-campus office and lab, or maybe he worked as a forensic scientist for the police or something. That could fit well given he wrote a well-known handbook on a form of apparently common law enforcement on this planet, given the presence of the other superheroes throughout the show. We could even go as far as to speculate that this is maybe where Stephen and Amazo guy could have met before collaborating on the handbook. Usually in real life, since a professor is very publicly an expert in whatever field they're in, they might do consulting work for people that are actively in the field. I think Stephen could have done something like this. I like to imagine that Stephen was approached by the city and they were like, "You have an incredible skill set, come work with us." And Stephen was like, "Well, what would I do?" And the city was like, "Well, you'd assist the police department in solving difficult crimes and other sciencey problems the city's facing. You could also get a lab." A lab? Say less. And he's just thinking about how he's going to be the first person in Fair City to split an atom in his PJs. His space on the fourth floor seems to be split into two sections, the office and the lab. The office is built with dark greenish blue bricks that travel all around the room and up the walls, with the odd feature of iron bars as windows. This room is also decorated with a bookshelf, various books, vials, and beakers, what seems to be like a very complicated contraption connected to the door, possibly a Rube Goldberg machine that functions as a door lock, a few control panels, an entrance to the laboratory section of the space, and what looks like to be a composter or incinerator machine as a trash can. He does seem like the kind of person to create a trash can but built with 1,000 lasers to dissolve a sandwich wrapper from his lunch. The lab is coated with metal plates on the walls in a much brighter color and a light orange paneling along the bottom of the walls. The double doors to this area also seem to be armed with a complicated machine that's likely another lock. This area contains another control panel and a testing chamber that are connected communication-wise via an overhead paging system, Steven being able to talk to her from the control panel and Word Girl being able to hear from the speakers inside the chamber, as well as the giant window at the control panel. These two sections, the office and the lab, seem to both have doors leading to a hall that's not directly part of his designated space, which is why I think that these are two different and connected spaces instead of just one big one. When first watching the short, I didn't really notice the change of setting, but I thought it was nice to show a more fleshed out setting to show the transition between the brainstorming phase and the testing phase. It might just be me, but the transformation seems very early, like pre-2010s. I don't know, I feel like whenever we usually have scenes like this these days, it's full of meaningless science jargon that only serves to make the smart character seem smart. So it's cool when you can sort of understand or at least somewhat follow what the characters are saying. I've said this in another video, but I really did appreciate the more advanced writing, and in this sense, advanced doesn't mean impossible to understand with science words, just big science words that make sense, and you can look it up later, I guess, or guess what it means through context clues. This is vaguely related, but I'll mention it anyway. One of my favorite things that writers do is include a lot of sciencey words, but you can follow along, and when you look up what the characters are talking about, it makes perfect sense. It's like when a character in a movie is playing an instrument correctly or something. It's so refreshing, and it means a lot to know that those behind the story care about the accuracy. I know this is petty, but I grew up playing the violin in school, and when I watched shows and movies that had a violinist character, the disappointment of seeing them completely butcher the instrument was so jarring, and it really took me out of the world that the show or whatever was building. It's totally okay to disregard this, though, for comedic purposes. Like when Steven uses nuclear fission to grill his cheese because it's silly, and it tells the viewer that this guy's a little unhinged. There are some elements of the Steven scenes that are very obviously foreshadowing, but there are a few details that could also be interpreted as foreshadowing if you think about it for several months, which I did. In the first Steven-centric short, after making his grilled cheese, he's seen eating most of it and discarding the crust afterwards. I thought this was funny because in the remainder of the show, he mainly eats cheese, and when his mouse brain is hungry, he won't touch anything else for the most part. And I know it's meant to be funny, but I can't help imagining a scene like, I sure do love grilling cheeses. I sure hope this isn't alluding to a lifelong devotion to obtaining this food type via crime. In the episode El Queso Misterioso, Two Brain states that he's just not interested in the tacos he and his henchmen went to eat if they didn't have cheese. Which honestly, yeah, I feel that. The grilled cheese and getting distracted by both a barbecue ribs recipe and his coffee cake hints at his already present food obsession and how silly and laid back he is. Establishing that these qualities are Steven's, and the hostility from Two Brains is Squeaky's influence. Squeaky is first introduced and shown locked up in a jail-like cage, which seems to foreshadow both his criminal tendencies and sort of ironic seeing Squeaky soon after have the freedom and power to roam free and take all the cheese he wants, while Steven is locked away in his own body. Also something funny, because Word Girl almost got bit by Squeaky, we know for sure Steven already got bit trying to put a matching bow tie on him or something. I think the best part of this character are the lovable flaws, like most characters in the show. The worst thing you can do as a writer is make boring characters, like making mentor characters perfect and flawless, since no one has a mentor like that. I think it's cool to see grown-ups and respected characters have weird quirks that'll never change, and it's just part of their character, just like how a lot of us have weird quirks that are just part of us. Steven's personality can be described as kind, helpful, a little silly, brilliant, and a bit of a show-off. These elements show up fairly often in Two Brains' behavior, and we can tell for the most part which brain is having the most influence depending on the day. Steven is Word Girl's first choice in seeking advice and encouragement about her superhero problems, going to him right after her second lost battle with the Butcher, and Steven listens and does everything he can to offer his expert assistance, going as far as to run basic tests, which they seem to run often given how familiar he is with the extent of her powers. This tells us he's a pretty generous person, even offering to make Word Girl a grilled cheese after he shows himself making one. though he might be the kind of person to not like when that choice is taken away, given how he was a little upset when Huggy ate his coffee cake without asking. Steven's love for machinery greatly contributes to his habit of creating overly complicated devices that do very simple tasks just because he likes the process. The toaster in the background of the short "What's Up, Doc?" is apparently powered by nuclear fission, for example, suggesting that method with the exclamation of critical mass, which is a scientific term meaning the minimum amount of a given fissile material necessary to achieve a self-sustaining fission chain reaction, according to Britannica. The same overly complicated methods are in the locking mechanism of his office and lab doors as well. This is one of those traits I absolutely adore because I relate to it as someone who likes to doodle and paint. Enjoying the process of something so much that you'd purposefully prolong the time it takes to get to the end is something that many people do as well. Taking an all-day train to see the country and hand-kneading bread, for example, extends the enjoyment of an activity and can be relaxing. Steven seems to have this outlook on how he enjoys tinkering, and this trait definitely shows up in Two Brains. We know he's capable of things ranging from turning stolen potato salad into cheese, like in the episode When Life Gives You Potatoes, to things as drastic and cosmically alarming as stopping time, like in the episode Time Out with Two Brains. Despite characters having odd reactions to his overly complicated machines and plans, he always defends his methods, and it's clear he just enjoys the process itself. As Two Brains, his main drive is enjoyment of whatever he's doing. Something interesting we see Steven do the first time we see him is a display of an experiment, which, once again, involving nuclear fission, he seems to enjoy showing off his tinkering and experiments to an audience. We see this quality shine through in almost every Two Brain-centric episode, where he explains his plan to his henchmen in enthusiastic detail, sometimes Word Girl and Huggy as well, including cute illustrations on a chalkboard as visuals. There might be a few different reasons he has this love for his work to be witnessed, but I personally think it may just be because he experiences so much joy with his creations, and his immediate thought is that he must show it to people. It's kind of like when you like a show so much you become a video essayist so you can share everything you can and talk to people in the comments about it. It might also explain why he became a professor in the first place. His love for sharing the things that excite him probably led him to choosing that career. The first few lines in Steven's debut short make me laugh when thinking about Steven's mannerisms. It's also funny to imagine Word Girl showing up to Steven's office and knocking on the door, and before she can say anything, he's like, "Do you guys want to see something cool?" And she and Huggy are like, "Yeah, alright." And he leads them in, scurrying to his equipment like a mouse, and starts his insane demonstration on how to make a grilled cheese in the most unnecessarily difficult way possible, and then asks her why she's there afterward. In this whole time, Word Girl has a very pressing issue, but patiently waits until after his experiment, and even saying hi to his new pet is so funny to me. I think I'll talk more about that when I do a character analysis video on her later. Another silly thing is that a few moments later, when Word Girl is talking about how frustrated she is with the butcher, she says, "It's this guy, the butcher. He's gotten away from me twice, but I don't know how to stop him." And Steven, a little confused, asks, "And that's a bad guy?" This line didn't really stand out to me until I realized Steven probably thought that Word Girl was trying to track down a very specific butcher for some normal butchering services before realizing that that'd be a very silly thing to come to him to ask for help, since their friendship mostly consists of mentoring on superhero science and law enforcement topics. I don't know, I thought this was funny. Something similar to sharing his education with others, but on the opposite end of wholesome traits, Steven doesn't seem to like when something is explained to him when he clearly knows whatever is being lectured to him. In his first short, he uses the word vicious, and Word Girl expertly follows it up with the definition of the word. Steven, thinking she was defining it for him, replies that he knows. It's a little funny that he assumed that she was defining a word that he just used correctly, but maybe she's unnecessarily defined words for him in the past from excitement or because that's something that kids often do. In Steven's first short, Word Girl asks why he has a vicious lab mouse, and he replies that he bought Squeaky because he was on sale. This suggests that Steven was at the pet store and looking for a mouse to use for his experiment, and this evil little reject mouse was the cheapest, and he might as well give him something to do, knowing well that mice need stimulation, and his experiment was perfect for seeing what was on his mind. Steven also seems to be very trusting and naive. We first see him being okay with leaving Squeaky alone next to a dangerous experiment in the care of a disembodied voice he learned about very recently. This trait appears in Two Brains when he easily gets overpowered by sneaky mice, at least twice, of course not counting the first time. We see the first time it happens in Mouse Army and again in Dr. Two Brains' Mr. Cheese, where Two Brains finds himself being used by the mice and eventually saved by Word Girl in both instances. This might be alluding to that sometimes he's too much in his own world to notice what somewhat obvious warning signs of things that are not going his way, which led to the creation of Dr. Two Brains in the first place. In the Mr. Cheese episode, I'm convinced it was Squeaky who was the one who couldn't keep up and became Mr. Cheese's henchman, because only Squeaky cared when Miss Power told him she'd deprive him of cheese forever, and he cried, and she hadn't even done it yet. I think it's Squeaky who folds when physically or intellectually overpowered. When Squeaky was in full control of the body, he pretty much immediately surrendered and let the regular Dr. Two Brains come back once his henchmen told him that they didn't like him. Squeaky isn't very smart, and in the What's Up Doc short, Steven has to explain his science jargon to him so he understands. When Mr. Cheese overpowers him in intellect and ability, it was only a matter of time before Squeaky became the henchman. Steven didn't seem like someone that cared about what other people thought. He gleefully got distracted and did his own thing, but for the sake of politeness tried to stay on track with Word Girl, so she could get the advice she needed in the short. As well as keeping Squeaky in the lab, he also had a baby elephant in there for purposes likely relating to other science experiments. Of course, this baby elephant didn't follow Dr. Two Brains to his abandoned warehouse, and if I were to guess why, I would imagine that maybe Two Brains had no reason to keep it around with his new cheese-devoted life, and wrapped up all the Steven stuff at the same time he switched ownership of his lab to Professor Tubing. In the episode Peanut Butter Battles, we see an elephant on the farm that Word Girl and Chuck are fighting at, and it looks just like Steven's elephant, so maybe he left it there to live out the rest of its life with the other animals and a loving farmer tending to it. An alternate theory is that maybe he was just renting it, but I like the idea that he used his real adult money to adopt a baby elephant and played with it and fed it like any parent would for a baby. So this is the part of the video that will bring me the most joy in presenting. The most canonical and obvious angst that Word Girl has to offer its characters is surface level. Not that bad, unless you think about it for more than 2 seconds. I have thought about Stevens for longer than his entire runtime, and that much contemplation can usually get you to a few conclusions. So Two Brains feels guilty for leaving his old life, and he feels pride for the man he used to be, but doesn't dwell on it for too long. In the episode Showdown at the Secret Spaceship Hideout, there's a very popular scene where Two Brains zaps Word Girl's bookshelves, and the books scatter onto the floor, and the one that lands on him is the one he wrote that I mentioned earlier. He's confused like, what's this? Superheroes and You, a Practical Guide? What kind of goofball would write? Oh, this is the book I wrote before I became an evil genius supervillain. And Word Girl swoops in like, I know, most of what I learned how to be a superhero I got from that book. And he makes a snarky remark about how the movie's better, and Word Girl ignores that and replies with so much respect and admiration, you were a great scientist before you turned to a life of crime. And he's genuinely happy for a brief moment, thinking back to his old life and how proud he was of his accomplishments that likely saved hundreds of people in the city. This scene always violently reminds me that Two Brains was an accident, and the last time we get to see Steven talk, it's in the short Mousetrap, and he's so anxious and feeling guilty about being used to commit crimes. So we know some form of Steven may still exist, but of course there's the creative shift ordered from Scholastic or PBS when the full series began airing to change the Jekyll and Hyde trope to more of a third personality of Two Brains. Oftentimes, Two Brains doesn't think about or remember his time being Steven fondly or even correctly or normally. In the episode Showdown at the Secret Spaceship Hideout, Two Brains goes on a mini rant saying, "This is Word Girl's spaceship hideout. I remember her telling me about it back when we were friends. Harumph. Some friend she turned out to be. She never invited me for a secret hideout dinner, despite her frequent and often uninvited visits to my lab." And in the same episode, he doesn't even remember his own book like I mentioned earlier. It's like he has to make a conscious attempt to remember the Steven details about his past. Even in the episode Mousebrain Takeover, he tells his henchmen that it was his idea to become Two Brains. This could be either Squeaky's overbearing influence skewing the truth, Steven being embarrassed about how easily he was corrupted, or a darker third option that this is something that he secretly wanted to try but wasn't ready for yet. A more obvious trait difference between the two is that Steven seems to be a bad liar and Squeaky's a good liar. Whenever Two Brains is trying to lie about something good or neutral, it's very obvious he's lying because it doesn't come naturally to Steven, though he's okay omitting and hiding information like at the end of his debut short. In the episode Mousebrain Takeover, Squeaky lies several times and easily tricks everyone around him because it comes so naturally to the Mousebrain. Similarly, in the episode Don't Mess with the Best, Two Brains tricks Victoria Best into triggering the safeguard in the cheese race she stole from him, as a joke and to disarm her so he and the other villains could get their things back and defeat Word Girl themselves. Steven seemed to have sort of a caretaker personality that's present in how Two Brains' paternal instincts from Steven kick in whenever he's dealing with the henchmen whenever it's not cheese related. In the episode The Ballad of Steve McLean, he asks them if they've both bathed yet before they're allowed to join him in watching their nighttime shows. When Cheese is involved, he bullies them, though there are plenty of examples of this, and it's very obvious that this trait comes from Squeaky in the Mouse Brain Takeover episode. Two Brains can and does have normal people days. In the episode A Few Words from Word Girl interrupts what was Two Brains having a normal day, drinking orange juice he made himself, and what looks like a bowl of cereal for breakfast. Word Girl tries to motivate him to steal cheese, but he's not totally up for it, seemingly content about hanging out and having a laid-back morning. Eventually, he does go to the hardware store to buy some supplies since he only steals cheese unless he plans to use the other stolen thing in a cheese scheme. And Word Girl once again pushes for the cheese crimes to happen. This takes a lot of convincing, and he ultimately does go and try to rob the cheese delivery van. But that likely wouldn't have happened if Word Girl hadn't meddled in his plans for the day. Something that probably no one but Two Brains notices about the whole Two Brains situation is that Two Brains experiences headaches, and a lot of the pain and discomfort from not giving into cheese cravings as punishment. This could be interpreted as Steven giving into the temptation because of the pain and living with the constant fear of pain and torment from Squeaky making him do things. Or this is a third personality that has both influences, but Squeaky chooses to cause pain. This is visually shown whenever we see his mouse brain glowing green and pulsing. In the episode Dr. Word Girl Brains, we see that even after Word Girl and Two Brains switch bodies, Two Brains still immediately wants to steal cheese, but after realizing that without the mouse brain bothering him about it, he actually wants to try being a hero until he can think of his next step. This one I think is the saddest one because it's very canon, and he's just a nice guy who has an evil mouse brain stuck to his head. Professor Steven Boxleitner has become one of my favorite characters of all time, and it's really just me making stuff up from the details I pick up on. He surprisingly has a lot of deep lore to his character and is mostly consistent in the show. I really like tragic scientist characters that were once pillars of good, but succumbed to their own hubris. Okay, Angst speed round. Here are some things that I said to someone who specifically and jokingly asked for no more angst. I wonder what the moment Word Girl realized that she'd never get to visit Dr. Boxleitner again was like. She'd never get to have a spontaneous lunch date and talk about all her hero problems again. She'd never get to see his cool experiments again, excited about his latest breakthrough. She'd never get to try his cooking that he was so proud of again. She'd never get to talk to someone who truly understood her like that again. It's like he was gone, but was forced to watch someone else use his body for the very thing he dedicated himself to stopping. Because Squeaky makes everyone call them Dr. Two Brains, he made it so that no one will ever acknowledge Steven Boxleitner again, erasing him from his own life. Imagine Steven still in there, desperately hoping one day he'll hear someone say his own name after so many years of his whole sense of self being purged. When Steven sees Squeaky about to hit the "holy cow, don't press this button," he immediately says, "Oh boy, this is gonna sting." And not only the fusion was probably super painful, the cheese-craving headaches are probably so much worse every day. Okay, I'm done. Subscribe for more video essays that are specifically catered to me and my friends, and check out my Ko-Fi where supporters can control what the next video will be about, and see other cool bonus content. I hope you enjoyed. Bye! Also, by the way, I looked up how to become an expert in a field, and I found this list on Indeed, and I think all but one applies to me. I've reached out to the only other authority I know of, but I haven't gotten a reply back, unfortunately. I think it's still a great and totally responsible idea to consider myself an expert on this character. Who's gonna correct me? PBS? They'd have to act like Word Girl's real and get those 4K high-definition shorts from the PBS Kids vault and show them to the world. Okay, anyway, love you, bye, for real this time.